Beneath the dormant volcanoes of Anatolia, nearly 8,000 years ago, a Neolithic hand grasped a shard of volcanic glass. It was not a tool for hunting, nor a weapon for war. This jagged piece of obsidian, polished to a dark and glossy sheen, offered humanity its first terrifying glimpse into the abyss of the self. Before this moment, one could only know their face through the rippling distortion of a river or the eyes of a lover.
Rarely had a human being gazed upon their own visage with startling clarity. In the settlement of Catalhoyuk, these dark stones were buried alongside the dead, suggesting a connection between the reflection and the soul that transcends mere vanity. It was a confrontation with identity that was entirely visceral. For the first time, the I was separate from the we, and the individual ego began its slow, inevitable ascent.
To understand the ancient mind, one must realize that their world was not visual in the way ours is today. They lived in a realm of acoustic and tactile sensation. The visual confirmation of one's existence was a fleeting phenomenon. It was a moment of the ephemeral, which means lasting for a very short time, a concept that defined early human perception. A reflection in water vanishes with a pebble's toss. A reflection in stone, however, endures. Down the winding length of the Nile, the obsession with the eternal soul manifested in burnished metal. The Egyptians, masters of preservation, did not rely on the black darkness of obsidian. They turned to copper and bronze, hammered into discs that mimicked the solar disk of the god Ra. Yet, these were not the silvered surfaces we take for granted in modern bathrooms. They were warm, orange, and deeply flattering to the complexion. Seldom does one consider how the medium dictates the message. An Egyptian aristocrat looking into a bronze mirror saw a golden, glowing version of themselves, devoid of wrinkles or gray hairs. The reflection was an idealization, a lie forged in metal. It reinforced the belief in their own divinity and perfection. The mirror was not a tool for truth, it was an instrument of cosmetic propaganda. Creating such an object required immense skill and patience. To achieve even a murky reflection, an artisan had to burnish, which is to polish metal by rubbing until it shines, a tedious labor that could take days. Consequently, the ability to see oneself was a luxury reserved strictly for the elite. The common laborer built the pyramids, but lived and died without ever truly knowing the shape of his own jawline. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks viewed the reflection with a mixture of fascination and profound dread. The myth of Narcissus is not merely a cautionary tale about vanity. It is a warning about the danger of the image replacing reality. Narcissus did not fall in love with himself. He fell in love with a reflection he did not recognize as himself. He died because he could not distinguish the subject from the object. Little did the philosophers of Athens know how prophetic this myth would become. They understood that the mirror created a duplicate, a doppelganger that lacked a soul. To capture one's reflection was to risk trapping the spirit within the glass. This is why even today we have superstitions about breaking mirrors. It is an ancestral fear that by shattering the image, we inadvertently shatter the self. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, industrialized this vanity. They produced hand mirrors of silver and lead in vast quantities, spreading the awareness of the individual across the empire. Yet the image remained imperfect. The silver tarnished quickly, requiring constant maintenance. A Roman matron spent her mornings fighting the oxidation of her own image, a poetic struggle against the inevitable decay of time.
During this era, the mirror began to take on a role beyond mere grooming. It became a tool for the occult. Seers and oracles would stare into the polished surfaces, believing the distortions were messages from the gods. This was the practice of catoptromancy, meaning foretelling the future using a mirror, became a dark obsession among the superstitious classes.
It is fascinating to observe how the material limitations of ancient mirrors shaped the psychology of the era. Because the reflection was dim and nebulous, the ancient person did not obsess over pores and blemishes as we do. Their self-image was softer, more forgiving. They saw a general outline of their existence, not a high-definition critique of their flaws. In the Americas, the Aztecs returned to the primordial darkness of Obsidian. Their god, Tezcatlipoca, whose name translates literally to smoking mirror, was a deity of night, sorcery, and judgment. He saw all deeds through his obsidian looking-glass. Here, the mirror was not for checking one's hair. It was an instrument of divine surveillance. The reflection was not yours to own. It belonged to the gods. Never had the world seen a civilization so fixated on the connection between light and stone. The Aztec priests would gaze into these black mirrors to communicate with the underworld. It suggests a fundamental difference in worldview. The West looked into the mirror to see the ego, while the Mesoamericans looked into the mirror to see the void. As the classical world crumbled and the Middle Ages descended, the mirror underwent a retreat. The Christian Church viewed excessive self-contemplation as a sin. To look at oneself was to turn away from God. St. Paul famously wrote of seeing through a glass darkly, acknowledging the imperfect nature of human perception. For centuries, the clear reflection was lost, replaced by the murky, distorted metals of the past. During these centuries of relative darkness, the average person relied on the community for their identity. You knew who you were because your village told you who you were. There was a lack of solitary verisimilitude, which means the appearance of being true or real, regarding one's own physical form. You were a construct of other people's descriptions. It was not until the glassmakers of Sidon, and later the master craftsmen of Venice, began to experiment with lead backings that the fog began to lift. But that is a later chapter in our story. For thousands of years, humanity walked the earth like ghosts, visible to everyone but themselves. Scarcely can we imagine the psychological isolation of never meeting one's own eyes. We assume that self-awareness is innate, but history suggests it is technological. We needed the stone, the copper, and the silver to teach us that we exist as separate entities. The ancient mirror was a heavy, expensive, and magical object. It was kept in boxes, wrapped in silk, and unveiled only for moments of significance. It was not a mundane fixture of the hallway. To look into it was a ritual, a confrontation with the strange other that lived on the surface of the metal. Thus, the origins of the mirror are not rooted in optics, but in magic and psychology.
It was the first time the human mind was forced to process the duality of the observer and the observed. We were no longer just looking at the world. The world, through the metal, was finally looking back.
As the heavy curtains of the Middle Ages enveloped Europe, the mirror retreated into the shadows of superstition and scarcity. For 1,000 years, the only reflections available to the common man were found in the stillness of a pond or the polished bottom of a copper pan. The Church held a monopoly on truth, and individual vanity was discouraged as a spiritual distraction.
Rarely did one encounter a true mirror in a medieval household. When they did exist, they were small, convex discs of blown glass, backed with lead or silver. These bullseye mirrors distorted reality, bending the face into a fisheye caricature. One looked into them not to admire beauty, but merely to catch the light, or to check for the presence of demons lurking behind one's shoulder. It was in the floating city of Venice, amidst the brackish waters of the lagoon, that the history of reflection changed course forever. The Republic of Venice understood that the secret to a perfect reflection lay in the purity of the glass. By the 13th century, the Venetian authorities made a drastic decision to move all glass furnaces to the island of Murano. Ostensibly, this relocation was to protect the wooden city of Venice from fire, but the true motive was far more insidious. The island became a gilded cage for the artisans. The Council of Ten declared that any glassmaker who attempted to leave the Republic would face the death penalty. They were prisoners of their own brilliance, guarding a secret that the world was desperate to steal. Inside the sweltering workshops of Murano, the maestri discovered a revolutionary technique. They applied a mixture of mercury and tin to the back of a flat pane of crystalline glass. This was not the dull, metallic reflection of the ancients. This was a mirror of terrifying clarity. For the first time, the human face was reflected back with brutal, high-definition honesty. However, this clarity came at a ghastly price. The process of creating these mercury mirrors was incredibly toxic. The artisans inhaled the fumes of the quicksilver day after day, suffering from tremors, tooth loss, and madness. The beauty of the Venetian mirror was born from a pernicious, which means having a harmful effect in a gradual or subtle way, atmosphere of poison and sacrifice. Seldom do we consider that the pristine reflections of the Renaissance were manufactured by men slowly dying for their craft. The cost of vanity was literally human life, yet the demand was insatiable. A single Venetian mirror, framed in silver or gold, cost more than a large naval vessel or a country estate. They were the ultimate status symbol, traded between kings and popes. If you find yourself captivated by this reflection on history and wish to polish your understanding of the English language further, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us in this intellectual pursuit. We shall continue to illuminate the dark corners of the past together. The monopoly held by Venice could not last forever, despite their draconian measures. The allure of the mirror was too potent. In the 17th century, the French minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert engaged in a daring act of industrial espionage. He surreptitiously bribed Venetian workers to defect to France, smuggling them across borders to establish the Royal Mirror Glass Manufactory in Paris. Little did the Doge of Venice realize that this betrayal would lead to one of the most resplendent architectural achievements in human history. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, utilized this stolen technology to construct the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. It was a declaration of absolute power, a gallery containing 357 mirrors.
Never before had a human being stood in a room of such infinite replication. At night, with thousands of candles flickering, the Hall of Mirrors dissolved the walls into pure light. The courtiers who walked its length were not just looking at the king, they were looking at themselves, multiplied endlessly. It was a psychological turning point for Western civilization.
The mirror was no longer a small, handheld object of private grooming. It had become architectural, immersive, and overwhelming. It shifted the focus of society from the communal to the individual. In the reflection of the glass, the ego began to inflate. One could now curate one's appearance with precision, practicing gestures and expressions to present to the court. This proliferation of mirrors coincided with the rise of the self-portrait in art. Painters like Rembrandt and Velázquez used the mirror to study the human condition, turning their gaze inward. The artist was no longer just a craftsman recording history, he was a subject worthy of observation. The mirror allowed the creator to become the creation. Yet, despite this explosion of glass, the mirror remained a luxury for the aristocracy. The peasant in the field still relied on the water bucket. It would take the Industrial Revolution to democratize the reflection, to make the image of the self cheap enough for the masses. But in the opulent courts of Europe, the stage was set. We must also consider the philosophical ramifications of this new clarity. As the image became sharper, the mystery of the soul seemed to recede. The mirror showed the surface so perfectly that people began to equate the surface with the truth. The ancient fear of the soul trap was replaced by a fascination with the social mask.
The Mercury mirror held dominion for centuries, a heavy and dangerous object that required a sturdy frame to support its weight. It was a fixture of the boudoir and the ballroom, a silent witness to the intrigues of the elite. It watched as empires rose and fell, capturing the faces of queens and revolutionaries with equal indifference.
Thus, the development of the mirror is not merely a story of glass and metal. It is the story of how we learned to see ourselves as the center of the universe. We moved from the murky, magical uncertainty of the Bronze Age to the sharp, toxic clarity of the Venetian era. We traded the safety of the shadows for the brightness of the ego. As the 18th century waned, the exclusivity of the reflection began to crack. The rumblings of the Industrial Revolution were not merely shaking the foundations of textile mills. They were vibrating through the very glass that held our image. The hegemony of the Venetian masters and the French royal courts was about to be dismantled by the cold, precise hand of chemistry. In 1835, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig altered the course of human perception. He developed a process that did not require the deadly fumes of mercury. By depositing a thin layer of metallic silver onto glass through the reduction of silver nitrate, he created a reflection that was safer, brighter, and infinitely easier to manufacture. Suddenly, the mirror was stripped of its lethal cost.
No longer did artisans lose their teeth and their sanity to the toxic vapors of quicksilver. The process became a matter of industrial routine rather than alchemical sacrifice. Factories could now churn out sheets of silvered glass with a speed that would have terrified the doges of Venice.
Little did the aristocracy suspect that their most prized possession was about to become common currency. The silvered mirror was durable and cheap. It escaped the gilded frames of the palace and found its way into the modest dwellings of the rising middle class. The monopoly on vanity was broken.
It was the dawn of a new era, where the image became ubiquitous, which means found everywhere or appearing to be in all places, a radical shift in visual culture. Before this moment, one might go weeks without seeing one's own face. Now, the reflection was waiting in every corridor and coat room.
Imagine the sensory assault of the Victorian city where this transformation took place. The air was thick with the acrid smell of coal smoke and the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones. Amidst this grime, the new industrial mirrors offered a pristine, gleaming counterpoint. They were pockets of perfection in a world of soot.
For the first time, a scullery maid could look into a small handheld glass and see the same face that her mistress saw. This was a profound equalization of the human spirit. The realization of the self was no longer a privilege of birth. It was available for a few pennies at the market stall. With this accessibility came a heightened sense of self-consciousness. The Victorian era became obsessed with appearance and propriety. The hall stand, a piece of furniture incorporating a tall mirror, became a sentinel at the entrance of every respectable home. One could not enter the public sphere without first consulting the glass.
The technology of large plate glass also transformed the city street. Shopkeepers realized that the reflection enticed the consumer. The shop window became a stage, and the pedestrian became both the audience and the actor. Walking down a London street became a performance, constantly monitored by the reflective surfaces of commerce.
Seldom do we acknowledge how this constant feedback loop altered our behavior. We began to view ourselves from the outside in. The internal monologue was silenced by the external critique. Was my hat straight? Was my collar clean? The mirror created a society of surveillance, where the primary watchman was oneself. This shift seeped into the literature of the time. Authors like Oscar Wilde explored the duality of the image in ways previously unimagined. The picture of Dorian Gray is perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale of this era, suggesting that while the mirror reflects the body, it might also hide the corruption of the soul.
Parallel to the mass-produced mirror came the invention of the daguerreotype. These two technologies marched hand in hand. While the mirror offered a fleeting glimpse, the photograph froze the reflection in time. The 19th century was the first era to document the human face with such relentless accuracy.
The industrial mirror was less forgiving than its predecessors. The silver backing provided a stark white light that revealed every blemish and wrinkle. The soft golden hue of the candle-lit Mercury mirror was gone. In its place was the clinical, unforgiving truth of modern science. We saw ourselves clearly, and not always kindly. Interiors became brighter. The mirror was used to amplify the light of gas lamps and, eventually, the harsh glare of electricity. Rooms were designed around the reflection. The mantelpiece mirror became the hearth of the home, doubling the size of the cramped Victorian parlor and offering an illusion of space. This was the democratization of the ego. The peasant, who once only knew his face from the rippling surface of a stream, now possessed a hard, static image of his identity. It solidified the concept of the individual. I am here. I am distinct. I am visible. Yet, as we moved deeper into the industrial age, the magic began to fade. When a miracle becomes mass-produced, it loses its aura. The mirror became a utilitarian object, a tool for grooming rather than a portal to the divine. We stopped wondering at the reflection and started critiquing it. The journey from the obsidian stones of Anatolia to the silvered glass of the factory tells the story of our obsession with the self. We conquered the chemistry, we mastered the manufacturing, and we distributed the image to the masses. But in doing so, we perhaps trapped ourselves in a cage of our own making. Scarcely could the architects of the early 20th century have predicted that the mirror would escape the interior of the home and climb the very walls of our cities. As steel skeletons rose to scrape the sky, builders began to wrap entire edifices in sheets of reflective glass. The modern metropolis became a canyon of light, where skyscrapers did not merely house the population, but reflected the clouds and the chaos of the streets below. This architectural shift signaled a change in our psychological landscape. We moved from the private contemplation of the vanity table to the public spectacle of the glass tower. The city became a hall of mirrors, fragmenting reality into 1,000 distorted angles. We were no longer just looking at ourselves. We were living inside the reflection, surrounded by a world that constantly bounced our image back to us. Then came the most surreptitious revolution of all. The mirror shrank. It became black, portable, and omnipresent. We entered the age of the digital screen, a device that functions as a dark mirror until it is illuminated by our touch. In this new era, the reflection is no longer passive. It does not simply return the light it receives. It curates, filters, and modifies the image before we even see it. We are now engaged in the creation of a simulacrum, which means an image or representation that is often deceptive, a fascinating distortion of truth. We edit our digital reflections, smoothing out the rough edges of our humanity, presenting a polished avatar to the world, while the real self remains hidden in the shadow. The glass of the past showed us our physical flaws. The black mirror of today encourages us to erase them entirely. Little did we realize that this new mirror would possess a voracious appetite. Unlike the silvered glass of the Victorians, which held no memory, the digital mirror remembers everything. It tracks our gaze, analyzes our insecurities, and feeds us a steady diet of what it thinks we wish to see. The feedback loop is no longer just between the eye and the glass. It is mediated by an invisible algorithmic intelligence. Yet, we must not be entirely cynical about this evolution. While we gaze narcissistically into our phones, other mirrors are doing the work of gods. High above the atmosphere, the hexagonal, gold-coated mirrors of the James Webb Space Telescope capture light from the very dawn of time. These instruments do not look inward at the ego, They look outward at the origins of existence, collecting photons that have traveled for billions of years.
There is a profound irony in this confluence of technologies. We use the same principles of reflection to take a trivial photograph of our breakfast and to detect the collision of black holes in the deep universe. The mirror is a bridge between the infinitesimal trivialities of human life and the resplendent grandeur of the cosmos. It spans the gap between the self and the infinite.
What, then, is the ultimate philosophical lesson of this journey? From the obsidian stones of Anatolia to the sensors of modern astronomy, the mirror teaches us that our perception is limited. We see only what is reflected, never the thing itself. We fall in love with the image, forgetting that it is merely a trick of light, a fleeting phantom that vanishes the moment the sun goes down.
We have spent 5,000 years perfecting the art of seeing ourselves, yet we remain strangers to our own nature. The mirror has given us clarity, but it has not given us wisdom. It has shown us our faces, but it cannot show us our souls. Perhaps the true challenge of the modern age is not to look more closely at the reflection, but to have the courage to look away.
Only by turning our backs on the glass can we truly experience the world directly. We must learn to see each other not through the mediation of silver, mercury, or pixels, but through the unadulterated light of presence. The mirror is a magnificent tool, a triumph of chemistry and physics, but it is a terrible master if we allow it to define our worth.
As you pass a reflection today, I invite you to pause. Look past the image. Look at the glass itself, the history it holds, and the strange, silent magic that allows you to be in two places at once. It has been a distinct privilege guiding you through this labyrinth of light and shadow. Thank you for watching, and until we meet again.